Hi everyone. So I do apologize if not having the lecture this morning was a little bit of an inconvenience for you guys. I am sorry for at the last minute having to kind of change the plan this morning, but hopefully you were able to use that time to maybe study or get some other things done. So if you're listening to this later in the day, thank you for checking back in. And please make sure if you have any questions about this information that you do not hesitate to reach out. These two chapters that we're covering today, display modes, chapter 11, and 2D imaging, chapter 12, these are the lectures where we start to kind of change into more of the clinical aspect of physics. So a lot of this information is probably going to start to click for you guys because you can relate it to what you're actually doing when you are scanning in lab or in clinical. So this stuff might make a little bit more sense. Not a lot of information in the display modes portion of this lecture, but when we get into 2D imaging, this is where we're going to take our knowledge of transducers a step further, and we're going to be talking about the specifics of each type of transducer, what we can adjust that affects how that transducer processes, how do our reflections that are processed in the transducer actually create an image on our display screen. So now we're really piecing together how we, go from the transducer to getting an actual image on our screen that we can evaluate. So let's start with our display modes first. Not a lot of information on this stuff, but it is important for us to know. We are actually using all three of these basic types of formats or display modes when we are using ultrasound for clinical imaging. So we're mainly relying on bright mode, but we are also using our M mode, which is motion mode, and we are sometimes using our amplitude mode, our A mode. When we are using spectral analysis or we're using pulsed wave Doppler, this is where we're pulling in a little bit more of the physics of amplitude mode. Now, before ultrasound was used for clinical purposes, before we were relying heavily on brightness mode or B mode, we were using amplitude mode. And really all that was telling us was that we are able to evaluate the strength of the reflections at a given depth. It wasn't really giving us much more information than that. We weren't really processing it in terms of an actual image of the organ or an image of the tissue. We were relying more so on how the reflections that we are receiving back into the transducer when we set a specific depth. And what does that look like? What does this display mode look like, or this format look like? Well, it looks very similar to our spectral analysis when we're doing Doppler. And as we know with spectral analysis, we are kind of using that amplitude to represent the strength and the velocity of the vessel that we're sampling. So that's kind of where we've pulled from this very basic amplitude mode, and we're using that more in our modern clinical aspect. But in and of itself, on that basic level, it's taking the reflections that are sent back from the body to the transducer, and it's processing them as these spikes on our display. So when we have our sound pulse that's sent in from the transducer, a very primitive, very basic dot is going to move at a kind of constant speed across the entire display screen. So very similar to that spectral analysis when we're Dopplering something. And then when we have those returned back from the body, it's going to be the same thing. We're still going to have a moving dot, but now that moving dot is representing those upward spikes, right? So as a series of upward spikes on the display screen. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Oh, I have a previous drawing here. Let me just erase this. Sorry, bear with me. So now you're probably thinking, well, this looks exactly like what we are doing when we are Dopplering something, right? And it's not the same thing. So it's important to know your display modes, and in terms of taking the registry, what is represented on your x-axis, your y-axis, and now we're adding in a z-axis, which we'll talk about when we get to brightness mode. But amplitude mode, unlike Doppler, amplitude mode is showing us the amplitude, so the strength of those reflections, and the depth of where those reflections are coming from. So that's a little bit different, right? Because Doppler is saying, okay, I want to look at the velocity of a vessel, but over a period of time, right? So as our waveform is coming across our spectral analysis window, it's showing us that on our x-axis, that's time, right? And then the bigness of our waveform would be our amplitude y-axis. But that is not what amplitude mode is. Amplitude mode is on a very basic level. We set the depth that we want the transducer to process the reflections from, and this is what we're getting, right? So this whole thing is saying that over a certain distance, right? This is our distance or our depth. What is the average amplitude of those reflections coming back to me? What is the maximum amplitude, right? So here would be our amplitude. How strong, how big are those reflections coming from that specific depth? Now, of course, it makes sense that the stronger reflections, right, the reflections with greater amplitude are going to represent these really tall spikes on this amplitude mode display, and then those weaker amplitude regions from that depth are going to be represented as smaller spikes, right? So here, really strong, really higher amplitude, and weaker, lower amplitude. So just keep in mind, our x-axis and our y-axis are not similar to Doppler, right? They're very different. And we're also not using, remember, this was a very primitive, basic format of ultrasound when it was first coming out. So we weren't able to evaluate the tissue when we were doing this. This is on that primitive level of an oscilloscope, right? Where you put that transducer down. Remember, transducer is only something that converts energy from one form of energy to another. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're getting that acoustic energy to be transmitted into some type of electrical energy at this point. So now brightness mode, also known as B mode. Now when you're scanning, you have a big old button on your console that has a B on it, and that's exactly what this is standing for. This is the brightness of our reflected echoes. This is really the first form of grayscale imaging. Now I did put a picture in the module for this week's lecture that showed one of the very first types of B mode that came out for clinical imaging, and you can see how different it is than what we are used to scanning. So very, very impressive how far brightness mode has come along since it first was originated. Now brightness mode, this is not going to take the amplitude, reflections at a specific depth, right? This is going to really take those dots. Now, we say dots a lot because we're talking about basically computer science here. So if you've ever done any type of coding, you know that there's a lot of binary numbers, right? Zeros and ones and dots and things like that. So this is where we're talking more so in the actual machine system, right? Lines or these dots. So now in brightness mode, these dots that have been converted from the transducer to our system are now going to be displayed in these varying levels of brightness. This is going to be created, of course, everything is created by a sound pulse in our transducer that's sent in. This invisible dot is going to move at a constant speed across the system's display, very similar to amplitude mode. And then when that reflection returns to the transducer, it's going to be processed, and then that invisible dot becomes turned on. Brightness, a particular level of brightness. So this is very computer-based information here. So our brightness mode, the brightness of that dot that is going to be processed and displayed on this mode is going to indicate the strength of that reflection that came back into the transducer. So weaker reflections are going to appear as darker gray dots, right? So these are going to be our hypoechoic structures, and our stronger reflections are going to appear as brighter gray dots. So this is really just talking about the brightness of those reflections, really nothing less. Now here we don't have a x-axis and a y-axis. right? We still have two axes, but it's an x-axis, and now we have a z-axis. So this is where we get a little bit tricky, and this is where the boards are going to want to test you. Your x-axis is going to be depth, so we're still looking at the overall depth of our image, right? How deep are we looking into the body? But now our z-axis, which is not going to be this, right? It's going to be our amplitude. So z-axis, it's going to be a little bit hard to draw on here, but say you had your x and your y-axis, and now your z-axis kind of comes into when we become 3D imaging. So imagine if that arrow was coming right at you. That's going to be your z-axis. So you have your x and your y-axis, which is your horizontal and your vertical, right? You're up and down and you're side to side. And now your z-axis is adding in a third dimension. This is your front to back on a very basic level. Now we're still in 2D imaging because we're not looking at all three of these axes. If we were looking at the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis in terms of a display mode, that's 3D imaging. Now, brightness mode is still only using two dimensions, x and z. We're just not using the two dimensions that we're used to using, our x and our y. So brightness mode is going to be a little bit different than A mode and M mode. So let's finish up with our M mode here. This is something that we use very frequently, especially in the OB world. This is when we are picking up motion. So we are looking to see how those reflectors at a given depth are moving and how that's going to be displayed on our screen. So again, very similar. Our sound pulse is created by our transducer, sent in. Our reflections are going to move at that constant speed. But now they're going to be moving from left to right across our screen. And it's going to represent any motion that comes up from that ultrasound emitted line or pathway. It's going to represent these kind of squiggly lines that are showing that change in depth of the structure that is moving. So what is that going to look like? Now, if you've done a first trimester OB or you've done even a second or third trimester OB, you have seen the technologists use M mode for any fetal heart rate. Now, you're probably thinking, well, it's a heart rate. Why wouldn't we just Doppler it, right? When you Doppler something, you're using pulse wave Doppler. We're going to learn about this a little bit more towards the end of the semester, but you are telling the system that you want it to use more power than just regular 2D imaging, right? Regular brightness imaging. We don't want that when we are looking at a baby, especially a first trimester baby. Any extra energy or concentrated energy being sent to a developing embryo is really going to be considered high risk. We do not want to do that. You always want to be measuring and evaluating a fetal heart rate using M mode because it does not send any extra energy to that developing baby. Now, developing embryos are very sensitive to any changes in heat. So when you send in more energy using your pulse wave Doppler, it's going to naturally be absorbed in a type of heat, right? So if we remember that, it's going to heat and absorption really do go hand in hand if we go back a few lectures. So we do not want to have any increase in temperature of the tissues of a developing baby. So that is our responsibility as a technologist, to always be using M mode when you are looking for fetal heart rate. Now, M mode, as we said, this is detecting motion, and we are looking at it in terms of a specific depth. So our x-axis and our y-axis, similar to amplitude mode, are going to be time and depth. But now our depth is on our y-axis and time is on our x-axis, and amplitude mode was showing us the strength, which we are not looking at in M mode. So now how do you read this M mode display, right? So if we look at our picture, we see our ultrasound line. So this is where you are telling the system that you want to sample and you want to see any motion that's occurring in that pathway. So that's where you are selecting where you want to pick up motion from. You're putting that line and you're putting that pathway right where you want to be evaluating. So in this example, we are looking at a heart, an adult heart, an echo picture. Now, when we are using M mode, our depth is displayed on our y-axis. So here's our depth, and our time is on our x-axis, okay? So depth with motion mode or M mode is going to be represented by the certain segments of that ultrasound line or that pathway that you selected. So here, right towards the top of our ultrasound line is going to be represented towards the top of our M mode display. And as we travel down that line, let me change my color here. As we travel down that line, that's what's going to happen in terms of our M mode display. So where the heart is contracting, right, where we're getting the motion from, we're not seeing any motion at the chest wall, right? This is all nice and level, nice and flat. Now we're getting a little bit deeper. Now we're actually into the heart, right? So we're starting to see some movement here, right? Our reflector depth is changing because that heart is contracting. Now we're into that left ventricle. So now we're getting lots of motion here, right? So that's where we're seeing that change. Same thing here. Left ventricular wall of the heart moving. Now, down here, let me erase that, hold on. Down here towards the bottom of our picture, we're out of the heart, so now we're not seeing any motion again. So pretty neat. Now, this is a lot more obvious than a fetal heart because the fetal heart is obviously very, very, very tiny. But I will show you how you would measure a fetal heart rate on this just as an example. A fetal heart rate using M mode, it is not as obvious as this. That motion is not as obvious, right? Because it's not changing depth as much as an adult heart is when it's contracting. But if we were to measure this, you want to measure from the start of one cycle to the start of the next cycle. So you would measure from here to here. Okay, so now we are moving into our two-dimensional imaging. So clinical imaging, we are really using 2D imaging to create our display, right? We are creating these slice images that are occurring at such a rapid rate that we're getting this great detail and we're getting this great resolution. Now, back in the day, original ultrasound, prior to it being clinical, was really only using one-dimensional B mode, where we're just getting these little dots of varying brightness, which is very similar to that picture that I posted in the module. But back in the day, we're just using one-dimension B mode, or we're using M mode only, or we're using A mode only. And we can use those, but only in specific situations are we going to use that, right? So like M mode isn't really going to help us determine if a person has a liver mass, right? It's really only going to tell us if we are evaluating a fetal heart rate. So there are these really specific indications and scenarios where we would only use M mode or A mode or one-dimensional B mode. I honestly can't even tell you an indication of why we would use A mode or one-dimensional B mode, and I can't even tell you how we would only get one-dimensional B mode on our system. So it's really only M mode that is situation specific that we would be using it for. So we are using two-dimensional B mode. So how are we going to create these two-dimensional images, right? So there are some challenges that are presented with that. Sound, as we know, travels in a straight line, and it needs to be narrow in order for us to have lateral resolution, right? How close can two reflectors be positioned but still represent two specific reflectors? Now, our system, in order to kind of compensate for that, our ultrasound system, is going to send in a very narrow pulse. It's going to receive the reflections. It's going to process and store that data. and then the system is automatically going to send in a second pulse at a slightly different direction. And that process is repeated hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. And those numerous pulses are going to create our 2D image. So when you are holding your transducer, say transverse pancreas, right at that epigastric region, even if your hand is not moving at all, your system is telling the transducer that, hey, I'm going to send in a pulse. We sent in this pulse going straight. Now I'm going to send in a pulse going slightly to the right, slightly to the right, slightly to the right. And it's doing that at a rapid speed that we couldn't even fathom, right? So it's happening so quickly that we are getting these pulses sent in. And at the same time, basically at the same time, the system is getting those reflections back, processing them, and storing them. So our systems are working at a speed that we just can't even imagine to create these high quality, detailed images with this great resolution. So clinical imaging, as we said, modern systems are going to process very rapidly. And not only are they processing rapidly, they're also sending out those pulses rapidly. So it's doing one thing and immediately doing another thing. Sending in the pulse, processing the reflections, sending, processing, sending, processing. So it's doing this give and take automatically. So if we were, just for an example here, if we set our imaging depth to 10 centimeters, right? So pretty deep into the body, with 90 pulses from our system is telling our transducer, hey, I'm sending you 90 pulses, you got to send those into the body. It takes 1/1000th of a second to send 90 pulses. So imagine how many pulses we would send in just 1 second. That's how we're getting these high quality images. That's why when we're scanning, it looks immediate on our screen, right? There's no delay from when we're scanning. And that's because clinical imaging in these modern systems are processing and sending so instantaneous. So, and here for an example, we're going to be kind of coming back to these types of images here, these pictures. These are the pulses that the system is telling the transducer to send in, right? So we're getting the electrical pulse from our system, and it's exciting those active elements in the transducer to send those in. So you can see our transducer is fixed, right? We're not really changing its angle, we're not moving it at all, but the system is still saying, in this position, I can send in these lines, these pulses, in a slightly different pathway, because of the capabilities of the transducer. So we'll talk about that a little bit further today. So first we're going to talk about a mechanical transducer. Now this is something that we don't really ever use a mechanical transducer. I'm not sure if Echo uses a mechanical transducer, but this is not something that you are going to be using as an ultrasound technologist. These transducers are going to contain a single circular disc-shaped active element. Now the transducers that we use contain multiple active elements. So this is where ours vary a little bit. This is a very basic type of transducer. It only has one active element. That active element is physically moved to create a 2D scan plane. So unlike what we just said about modern clinical systems where they can kind of send in pulses at slightly different angles from the transducer, this active element needs to be actually moved, right? So you can kind of rotate and twist these mechanical transducer surfaces. So some information that we're going to be talking about when we talk about all of these transducers, right? The crystal amount, shape, what type of image that produces, can we steer that beam, right? Can we focus that beam, and what happens if that crystal gets damaged? So of course, with a mechanical transducer, there's only one crystal. It's coin-shaped or disc-shaped. The image that it's going to create, so our display screen, is going to be fan or sector-shaped, depending on the transducer. It's going to have this spokes on a bike type of appearance with the crystal that moves. So again, not something that we are actually using, not something that you're going to have the experience with. We can do mechanical steering with this. Now, this is the rotation of the crystal, so you actually have to rotate it to create a 2D image, and that is known as mechanical steering. So that's not automatic steering or any inherent steering that comes with this type of transducer. And beam focusing, so this is going to have a fixed focal depth. You can focus this beam using internal and external focusing, but this is a very primitive type of transducer. This is not something that we can really be adjusting for as we're scanning with this. And now, unfortunately, if this crystal were to become damaged, say you drop it, say you put it in a autoclave, the entire image is going to be lost, right? Because your image is only created by that one crystal. So if that crystal is damaged, you're not going to be able to receive any type of reflections to be processed. So here is what a mechanical transducer looks like. Again, we're not using these in the clinical setting, but you do need to know in a basic sense what they are like. So here you have your coin-shaped or your disc-shaped crystal. Now you can steer it, right? So you can turn it, but that's something that you're going to have to actually manually do on the transducer. And that would, once you're turning it, that would be able to change the direction or the pathway of how you want that transducer to send in the pulses, right? And if you're scanning a patient, you don't want to have to do that, right? You want it to be kind of done for you. Moving into our transducer arrays. So these are the transducers that we're using. And when we're using the term array, we're kind of talking about a variety, right? It's like a fancy word for a variety. So our modern elaborate transducers are going to be known as array. And this is what we're using in clinical imaging, right? And we kind of have little variations between different types of array transducers. And we'll talk about that too. These transducers are going to contain several active elements. It could be made of one slab, quote unquote slab of PZT that's cut into separate pieces called elements. Or you could have several individual PZTs placed into a transducer. But for the most part, you're going to have one kind of piece of PZT that the manufacturers have cut up and divvied into their own little piece, and those pieces are known as the active elements in the transducer when we're talking about array transducers. Each element is then going to be connected to its own wire system, and that's how that element talks to the rest of the ultrasound system. So each element is going to have its own connection in terms of an electrical sense to the system. And that's how the system is able to automatically steer, automatically focus if we want to change our focus while we're scanning. Because each element is excited, right? When we're creating that pulse, is going to be excited in a different pattern. And our system can control that, right? So when you have only one piece of PZT, or you have only one active element or one crystal, it's only going to be able to do one thing at a time, right? But if you break up that and you have a bunch of different elements, you can say to your transducer, hey, elements on the left side, I'm going to send you in first. And then elements on the right side, I'm going to send you in. And that's how we can kind of create this balance of steering, right? And send in different pathways of those sound pulses. So a channel is known as one element, so one piece of PZT, a wire, and system electronics, so the connection to the ultrasound system. Each element is also going to be isolated from its neighbor. So when you guys go to take your physics exam and you go to a Pearson VUE testing center, they're going to put you in a little cubby, right? So you're all nervous ultrasound students to take your exam, right? You're all one slab of PZT, but they put you in your own cubby. So now you're an element, right? And now you're going to do your own thing with the computer when you're sitting there taking your exam. So that's kind of how it's working in terms of an array. Having multiple elements, so multiple pieces of PZT, is going to allow that transducer, like we said, to excite one or multiple elements in various ways or patterns when it's transmitting those sound pulses into the body. Now, there are three types of array transducers, and we're using these pretty frequently. So we have our first one, a linear phased array. This means that our active elements are going to be arranged in a straight line. So they're sitting right next to each other in a straight line. The footprint is going to be rather small, so it's going to be a 1 by 1 centimeter square, and this is something that is used very, very commonly in echo. So if you ever see like a really square, small type of transducer, that is an echo probe, so that they are using to look at the heart. The number of crystals or elements in shape, we have anywhere between 100 to 300 individual elements arranged right in a straight line across the probe. The image is going to be either fan or sector shaped. It's going to be similar to the mechanical in terms of our image, but the crystals do not move, right? So we don't actually manually move the crystals in order to create a 2D image. The only way we can create a 2D image with a mechanical transducer is if we actually move the crystal on the probe. We're not doing that with a linear phased array because we have those individual pieces of PZT. Now, beam steering, this is going to be done electronically. So this is known as a process called phasing, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So electronic steering, right, when we're saying to that transducer, hey, I go back a few slides here, and I erase this. Right, so electronic steering is saying to the transducer, hey, I know you want to send in your sound wave in a straight line, but I'm going to excite these crystals over here to steer our sound beam that way, or over here to steer our sound beam this way. So that's all happening electronically, and we can do that because we have the individual elements connected to the system. As for beam focusing, again, we can do this electronically as well. This allows us to actually be able to manipulate the focus of these beams and from these transducers. These are also capable of multi-focusing. So we can say to the system, hey, instead of one focal zone, I want 2 focal zones, right? I'm feeling a little spicy, I want 2. So this means that we're sending in multiple beams down that same exact pathway, but they have different focal depths. So now we're really kind of pushing the limits of what we can for that sound beam, right, of those sound pulses. So we're saying to the system, hey, you know, you have pathway A, B, C, D, and E all heading in at different angles, but on pathway B, I'm going to send in 2 pulses at the same time with different focal zones, focal zone positions. And that's how we get multi-focusing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Now, when we have a damaged crystal, unlike the mechanical transducer, our entire image is not lost, right? But we are going to have some artifact and some problems if we do have damaged crystals in a phased array transducer. So damage to one element on the transducer is going to cause inconsistent and erratic steering and focusing, right? Because if one of those elements is damaged and is not working, when the system says, hey, I'm going to send in pulses down this, you know, I'm going to excite these active elements, I'm going to send it down this pathway, and that pathway is not working, well, it's going to get a little confused in terms of, okay, well, wait a minute, how do I actually steer my sound beam this way if that element is damaged? I can't, right? So that's going to make our steering, our electronic steering and focusing a little bit more inconsistent. It's not precisely evident on the image because the other elements are going to compensate to create the image around where that sound beam would be coming from. So if your active element, your element piece is damaged, you're not going to be able to create any image from that line, right? But thankfully, our sound kind of, you know, has a width to it, right? If we remember our sound beams from last week where they diverge a little bit, we can pick up reflections from that scan line, even if that element is damaged from those neighbor elements beside it. So this is what that linear phased array transducer looks like. You can see kind of small footprint here, 1 by 1 centimeter square. It's going to be creating that sector or that fan shape, right? You can see that, those pathway, and also if you look here, right? Okay, So continuing on here with our linear phased arrays, how many elements in a phased array are used to create a single pulse, right? So all of those elements, so that 100 to 300 elements, are going to be excited to create each pulse. So we're using every element, basically. So we have 1 to 300 channels that create 1 to 300 small sound wavelets. Okay, so it's just a sound wave, but small. And the wavelets are going to interfere to create a single sound pulse. Okay, this is a little bit bizarre. The pattern is going to determine the direction and the focus. So how does the pattern of the electrical spike steer the beam in different directions? So now we're talking about, okay, all of our elements are excited, right? You would think that they would send in 100 to 300 sound pulses, but they're not. They're sending in 1 to 300 small waves, and then those small waves are going to kind of join together to create one single sound pulse. So now how do we, and now I should say this sound pulse is pretty large, right? Because we have 1 to 300 smaller waves creating it. So this kind of unified single pulse that's coming out of the transducer, the way that we excited those elements and the pattern in which we excited those elements is going to determine which direction we want that sound wave to take, or that sound pulse to take, and how it's going to be focused. So let's talk about steering first. So how can we determine the direction that a beam is going to be transmitted? So now we had 100 to 300 elements excited and activated in our transducer, right? When that happened, they created, 300 little smaller waves. All of those smaller waves got excited. They kind of joined together, they unified, and they said, okay, we're going to travel as one, basically, right? We're going to travel as one. Think of like a flock of birds, right? You have the whole flock, and then, they're all kind of heading in the same direction, but each individual bird's kind of doing their own thing. So that's a little bit better way to talk about steering and how these different elements kind of join together. So if we look at our picture on the left-hand side, so this is coming right out of our transducer, right? So here is a, actually, I lied. So here would be coming out of our transducer at this level here. So here are our electrical signals, right? They're coming from the system. They are exciting our active element, right? So that's going to be our layer right here, this yellow line. That's our active element. Now, everything, our electrical signals are all coming at the same time, right? All coming at the same time. They're exciting each of those crystals at the same time. So that means that our sound wave, when it joins together, is going to travel in a straight line, right? So we're not steering. We're not steering at all, because our electrical spikes all occurred at the same time. There was no pattern. There was no direction in terms of our electrical signals, our spikes. Now, if we look at the picture underneath, our system is now saying, well, I'm going to send this electrical signal first, and then immediately after I'm sending this one, and then I'll send this one, and then I'll send that one, and then this one, and then this one, and this one, and then lastly I'm going to send this one. So the spike on the right side is going to excite this crystal first, right? And then this one, and then the next ones, and then lastly the one on the left. So because we excited the crystal on the right side first, we're going to be steering towards the right. So look at the way, and now I say on the right side of our picture, that would be on the left side of our transducer. So our beam is steering in the same direction that we are exciting our active elements. So look at the pattern of our electrical signals, right? And then you want to draw, so you have that line there, right? And then you want to draw a perpendicular arrow from that line And that's how you're going to be able to tell which way that beam is going to be steered. Okay, that's exactly what we have written on this slide here. We're going to draw a line that connects our electrical spikes, and then we draw another line perpendicular away from that first line. The electrical spike patterns are going to be created by that system by exciting different crystals at different times in order to get that beam to steer in a certain direction. So these time differences are known as phase delays, right? So that kind of makes a little sense, right? It's a delayed reaction, and we're doing it in a phase. Okay, so now we've talked about steering the beam. Well, how do we focus the beam? And can we steer and focus at the same time? Well, of course we can. Our transducers are so modern and advanced that we can really make these beams do anything that we want, right? So how does the pattern of those electrical spikes from the beam former, which is something we'll talk about, right? So it's a component of our system that actually creates the sound beam. How do those electrical patterns or spikes affect how we can focus the beam during transmission? So our curved pattern, if we excite the crystals in a curved type of phase delay or in a specific type of pattern, and we create a curvature, any curvature of those electrical spikes will create some type of focusing. Now, the steeper the curve, the more focused our beam is going to be. So we're going to have shallower focusing, right? So we're going to have a decreased near zone length because our focus is going to be a lot closer. Now, if we have no curvature at all, right? So we're still exciting our active crystals at the same time, there's going to be no steering. So if there's no curvature, no slope, that means we are not focusing and we're not steering. So let's look at our pictures here. So again, our electrical signals are exciting our active elements. Our green elements there, our electrical signals are our red little dots behind them. On the previous slide, I think I said that our active elements were the yellow line, but that's not true. They're the green dots. So we have on our top left picture, we have our electrical signals occurring in a curved pattern. Right? So it's going to excite the crystals on the outside first, and then it's going to excite the crystals in the middle last. So because we are exciting the crystals on the outside first, right, they're going to go like this, and they're going to focus. So right here. Okay. Now, if we look at the picture underneath that, well, we have a really steep curvature. Right? So we have exciting crystals on the outside first, and then really a delayed reaction to excite the crystal in the middle. So that means that we're going to have very, very shallow focusing. So look how much shorter that near zone length is from the top one. So I'll erase that. So we're focusing with both of them, but because our curvature, our delay is greater on the bottom, it's going to result in shallower focus position. Now we can focus and steer at the same time. So if we have a curvature and a slope, we can do that. So if we look at our picture on the top right side, we still have a curvature, right? And then here's our slope. So this electrical pulse is going to excite that outside crystal first, and then there, and then, now we kind of have some coming in on the other side, and then lastly in the middle, right? So because we have that delayed electrical spike from the middle, that means we're going to be focusing. And because we have that slope, so we're sending in the pulses on the right side a little bit earlier than on the left side, we're now going to be steering, change my color, in this direction. Right? Remember, you want to draw that perpendicular line to the slope, and that will tell you the direction that you are steering in. Same thing on the bottom here. So we have our slope here. Oh, nope, sorry. We have our slope here. So we're going to be steering in this direction. and we have our curvature like so. So next we have our annular phased arrays. Hold on one second.